So my machine is threaded up, got my overlocker ready as well, and my iron all set up in the background, not switched on just yet, but ready to go. And we're going to start sewing up our dress. So I'm going to follow the instructions as they appear in the Tilly and the Buttons manual. So first thing to do is we're going to stay stitch the neckline edge of the front and the back bodice. So this is my front bodice panel here. That's the shoulder seam up there, and there's the curve of the neckline and the other shoulder seam. And what stay stitching is that you set your stitch length to quite a small length, so about between 1 and 1.5, and then you are going to start up here at the shoulder a centimetre in from the edge, and you're going to sew all the way round to the centre front. Then you're going to come off, trim the threads and start up here and come back here. And the reason why we do stay stitching is to stop that neckline from stretching out of shape. If you think about a woven fabric, you've got fibres running this way and then fibres running across. When we cut a curved neckline, we're cutting into that grid work of fibres that have been woven together. And that leaves these curved diagonal areas vulnerable to stretching. And what stay stitching does is locks that shape in place so that you won't end up with a wobbly neckline. So the other thing to mention about stay stitching is the direction that you stitch in really does matter. And in the instructions they'll tell you what to do. What you have to do is start up at the shoulder here and come down to the centre front, and then start up at the other shoulder and then come back down to the centre front. You want to do this, you do not want to start at one shoulder and go all the way around to the other. As your fabric is being walked through your machine, it will move and grow, and by the time you get to the other shoulder seam, you'll end up with a wonky shape. So it's really important with stay stitching to do it, not to leave it out, and also to do it as instructed by the manual. So we're going to do that on both the back and on the front bodices. And then we're also going to stay stitch along those long diagonal lines at either edge of the skirt. And again, it's quite a lot of stay stitching actually, but really, really worth it to give your dress longevity, to stop the skirt from draping and stretching and, ending up with a witchy kind of hemline. So definitely worth doing your stay stitching. Right, here's my machine. Hopefully, let's see, are we at a good angle there for you to see what I'm doing? Got a new clamp for my camera, my phone, and hopefully it works okay. It's seeming to hold everything in place nicely. Okay, so I'm going to put my fabric under here, and I'm just going to come in a centimetre from the edge. We've got a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance on this pattern. There we are. So I'm going to come round to the centre front. Let's put my needle down into my fabric. I'm going to use a straight stitch, and I'm going to reduce my stitch length down to 1.5, and I don't need to do a back stitch, and I'm just going to slowly, I don't want to stretch or rush or push my fabric through, I just want to guide it round that curved edge. And I'm just going to encourage the fabric in there. I don't want to be pulling it or anything like that. Just real, at this stage where you're doing the neckline, gentle hands, slowly does it. And it's frustrating because what you really want to do is get on and make your dress. And this feels like yet more preparation, but all these preparatory steps will lead to you having a really beautiful dress in the end. All the professional touches. And I'm just lining up my raw edge with that 10mm guide on my needle plate. I can see the crease there of where the centre front was, so I'm nearing the centre front now. There we are, so I'm at the centre front. I'll draw that out. Can you see that line of very, very small stitches going round there? And then I'm going to come back onto the other shoulder seam and do the same in the reverse direction. And I'm just going to sew all the way round and back to meet where I finished off. Then I'm going to trim those threads, and then I'm going to repeat that process on the going all the way around the back neckline. I'm using a universal needle for this bubble crepe. It's a new needle, nice and sharp, and it's a lighter weight one, so I think it's a size 70, and that's doing a good job. And I've now got my skirt panels. I've got my back skirt and my front skirt, and I'm just sewing from the waist down to the hem, all the way along the side seams, because those side seams are big long diagonal lines, and as such they will stretch if left to their own devices. So stay stitching those big long diagonal seams will just stop them from stretching out of shape. Stay stitching takes ages because it's such small stitches, so you know, patience is a virtue with this. Okay, so we've done our stay stitching, so you should have stay stitched your back and front necklines and your 4 diagonal lines on your back skirt panel and your front skirt panel, so you'll have those 1, 2, 3, 4 diagonal lines. So all of those should now be stay stitched, and we're going to start making the dress. Hurrah! Okay, so get your back bodice panel and lay that down in front of you with the right side looking at you. There's my shoulder seams, there's my neckline, and then I'm going to get my front bodice panel and put that on top of it so that right sides are together. So I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric, and then we're going to sew the shoulder seams. So there we go, right sides together, and there's a little notch to help you match things up, and then we're just going to pop some pins in along there, so from the neckline down to the sleeve. If you're doing the short sleeve, that will be your hem, or if you're doing the long sleeve, that's where your sleeve will join on. So match up those notches and pop a pin there, and then we're working with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance throughout, so we shall just sew both shoulder seams with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, matching everything up. So the raw edges should be matching. If this is your first go at dressmaking, just take your time and make sure everything is matching nicely, and make sure your seam allowances are accurate, because that will mean that everything will just come together beautifully for you. So pay attention to each sort of stage as you go along. There we are, so I've just pinned that shoulder seam there. The right sides together, raw edges matching, matched up the notches, and I'm just going to sew down there with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So let's bring my machine back into view. I'll move you in a bit. Here we are. My sophisticated camera work. Let's see, can you see okay? Hopefully you can, right, yes. All right then, so 1.5 centimetre seam allowances means that I'm going to match that raw edge here, these raw edges, up with my 15mm line, or I think that's 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to work in centimetres. I'm going to do a back stitch to begin and finish, and that will lock my stitches in place. So just a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back, and then very nicely, and I'm back to a normal stitch length of, I think my default stitch length on my machine is 2.2. So just move my pins at the other side so I'm not putting my hand in front of the camera. And when I'm sewing, my eye is here. I'm not looking at the needle, that's going to make me feel dizzy. I'm just looking at my raw edge of my fabric, and I'm looking at my 1.5 centimetre line, and I'm just guiding that fabric through. And when I get to the end, I do another couple of back stitches to lock in place, and I'm always taking my pins out as I go, and you'll notice that my pins are all this way. That's, I find, to be better. It secures the fabric better. It's a sort of conventional way to pin things together. There are exceptions, but okay, so all the way to the end. A couple of back stitches. Trim off that thread. And there's my shoulder seam. I'm going to repeat that same process on the other shoulder seam. So I've sewn both of my shoulder seams, and now I've got some raw edges here that I need to deal with. Now I've got an overlocker. Obviously I do a lot of dressmaking, and it's so I do use my overlocker quite a lot. If you don't have an overlocker though, that's not a problem. You can use your zigzag stitch. So select your zigzag stitch on your machine. And if you're not sure where that is, just have a little look at your manual for your machine. And then the way that I'm going to show you on a scrap, you would just neaten those raw edges. Actually, let's double it up to make it more realistic. So I'm just going to demonstrate on a scrap here. So you would just select your zigzag stitch, and then I'll just hand wind it to show you in slow motion. Oh, my machine does a little lock stitch to begin with when it does a zigzag. There we go. So can you see that needle's jogging over to the right hand side, and then it's going back over to the left, back over to the right. And what it's doing is, as it's sewing that zigzag, it's just neatening up those raw edges, like so. And that will stop them from fraying and give your fabric a bit of, or your dress a bit of longevity and wear and tear. Stop it from coming undone in the washing machine. So yeah, just neaten off your inside seams by zigzagging. And I think because this is quite a lightweight fabric, all of these I'm going to do together rather than separately. In some instances you might want to just go round and zigzag round everything before you start making the dress. But in order to save time, save thread, and also because this is a lightweight fabric, I'm going to actually overlock my seam allowances together once each seam is sewn to neaten them off. So I'm going to hop on over to my overlocker now and finish my seams. So I've set my overlocker up just with white thread. I already had white in it, and I thought that's fine. I don't really revel in the idea of rethreading my overlocker when I could be making a dress. So I've left the white in there, and I did a little test just to check that it wasn't going to sort of pop through and show up, and it doesn't. It looks absolutely fine. So I've got white threads in here, and I'm just going to overlock to neaten these seams. And I've only got one needle in. I've taken out my left hand needle because all I'm doing is finishing. I'm not actually sewing together, just using a neutral and that neutral on the differential feed, and regular stitch length, and I'm using 3 threads, and I'm just overlocking that seam allowance together, making sure that I've got nothing folded up under here, because that would be a catastrophe. There you go, so that's now overlocked together, and what I will do is I will just press that towards the back of the garment. So I'm going to do both of the shoulder seams. Where has my other one gone? Here it is. So I'm going to sew each seam, and then I'm going to overlock the seam allowances together. Okay, so there's my bodice so far. There's my shoulder seam that I've just done there, and on the other side the same. So you can see that your back neck is shallower than your front. And I've just taken that over to my ironing station, and I have just pressed the seam allowance towards the back. Always good to press as you go along. Keep everything, it's much easier to press as you go along rather than pressing it all at the end, and it just means that everything stays where you want it to. So that's my bodice. Now I'm going to move on to my neckline facing. So where have we got those pieces over here? So I've got my front and my back neck facing, and I'm going to put those, lie them down right sides together like this, and then I'm just going to simply put a couple of pins in and I'm going to sew them together along here. Now there's no need to overlock those because they're going to be, first of all they're interfaced, and then secondly they're going to be sort of on the inside. So once I've sewn these together, these shoulder seams, I shall press them open and flat, and that will reduce a little bit of bulk at the shoulder area. There we go. So we're just going to line those up, raw edges matching, and a couple of pins to keep those in place. And then remember, you used a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, so you're going to do exactly the same. And just this is where it's really important that you are accurate with your seam allowances, because if you do a different seam allowance on your dress than you do on your facing, they won't fit. So just make sure that you're consistent with that. Okay, so lining the raw edges up with my 1.5 centimetre line, a couple of back stitches to secure. And there we go. So I'm going to do that, and then what I'll do is I'll take that over to my ironing area and I will press that open and flat to keep it nice and flat on the shoulder there. Okay, so next up I want to attach my facing. So I'm going to put my top down. I've got my shoulder seams here and here, and there's my neck hole. My neckline, neck hole. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my facing. Oh, I overlocked around the edge of that facing as well, just to make it look neat. And you could overlock or zigzag yours all the way around the edge. So I'm now going to put this right sides together. So the right side of the outside of my bodice and the right side of my facing are going to be touching, and I'm looking at the wrong side. And I need to just match that all the way around. Just make sure that you've got the front to the front and the back to the back. Now you can see that that's the front because the front is deeper than the back. And again on here, yeah, you can see that that's the front, because if I'm holding that by the shoulders, it's not a kind of, when it's all laid out in front of you, it's not massively obvious, but once you look at where the shoulders are and you hold it there, you can see that the front scoops out a bit more. You want to make sure that you get that right, because otherwise you'll distort the shape of your neckline. You want to make sure that you're attaching the front facing to the front and the back facing to the back. So this is where pins are going to be your best friend. Start off by pinning at the shoulder seam, matching up those shoulder seams, because that's an obvious place where this is going to go. So I'm matching up the shoulder seam of my dress with the shoulder seam of my facing, and I'll just pop a pin in there to hold that. And then you can just match round the curves there. You should be able to see, if you cut your notches into your neckline, that they match up. Obviously your notches that you've cut into your facing are now going to be a little bit fused together because they've had the interfacing put on them. If you just walk round, you should be able to just pin your facing to your bodice and it should just match up. Now remember that you're dealing with a 3-dimensional shape, so you know it's not going to be completely flat. You know, you've got an angle on the shoulder seam, so it's just a bit fiddly, but you just want to make sure that those edges, those raw edges, match up, and then we're going to create your neckline. And really, you know, take your time, plenty of pins at this stage, matching up those notches. And around we go. Can't have too many pins when it comes to this neckline. And you see how that's just matching up round there. If you find that it doesn't match up, just keep walking your fingers round and matching up the raw edges. They will fit, especially if you've done your stay stitching and you've kept your seam allowances the same. They should just fit really nicely. So that's my neckline edge just matched there. I can see that pin's got caught on their fabric. There we go, that's my neckline edge all pinned, and I'm now going to go all the way around there with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Okay, so I'm just going to slide my whole top under there so that, can you see I'm going to sew around this neckline edge. Just wanted to sort of zoom that back so you could see how that goes all the way under there. Let's move back in so that you can see what I'm sewing. Whoops-a-daisy, here we are. Okay, so I'm going to start at one of the shoulder seams. Take that pin out. Anchor by depressing my needle in there. And I'm just going to make sure that this raw edge matches with the 1.5 centimetre line. A couple of back stitches to begin with, even though I'm going round in a circle, and round I go. I'll take those pins out as I go. I'm keeping my eye here, and I'm going round a curve, so I want to keep nice and slow. And when you're going round a curve, it's quite a good idea to, you know, use a smaller stitch length. I think I'm just using my 2.2, but smaller stitches are easier to get round the curves. And every time I get to a point where I need to sort of move the fabric round a bit, and you can always leave your needle down, lift your presser foot and wiggle. Just make small minor adjustments as you're going around that curve. But really, the more accurate you can be about following that even seam allowance all the way round, the more of a nice even curve you're going to get on your neckline. So